There was a time when betrayal happened once and consequences followed swiftly, when forgiveness was earned through genuine change rather than demanded after empty promises, and when people understood that some patterns reveal character rather than circumstance. But what happened to Diane Thompson on Steve Harvey's show would prove that sometimes the hardest question is not whether you can forgive someone, but whether forgiving them means enabling behavior that will inevitably repeat. When this 51-year-old woman stood before America and asked whether she should give her husband a fourth chance after discovering his third affair in their 18-year marriage, Steve Harvey delivered an answer so direct and so uncompromising that it sparked a national conversation about the difference between forgiveness and foolishness. What happened next showed millions of viewers that grace without boundaries is not love, but self-destruction, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is refuse to participate in someone else's pattern of betrayal. If you believe that actions reveal character and that patterns predict future behavior, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. What you are about to witness is a woman at a crossroads between hope and reality, and the moment when brutal honesty became the kindest gift anyone could give her. Diane Thompson was 51 years old, an administrative coordinator at a hospital in Memphis, Tennessee, and the mother of two teenage sons who were 15 and 17 years old. She had been married to her husband Kenneth for 18 years, though those years had been marked by a cycle of betrayal, forgiveness, and repeated heartbreak that had defined much of her adult life. To outsiders who did not know the full story, Diane and Kenneth appeared to have weathered normal marital challenges and remained committed to their family. But the reality was far more painful and complicated. Diane had grown up in a deeply religious household in rural Tennessee, the daughter of a Baptist minister and a church secretary who had taught her that marriage was a sacred covenant, that forgiveness was the highest virtue, and that wives had a special obligation to stand by their husbands through any difficulty. Her mother had often quoted scripture about forgiveness 70 times 7, about bearing one another's burdens, about the wife being the heart of the home who could save her husband through patient endurance and unconditional love. These teachings had shaped Diane's understanding of what it meant to be a good wife and a good Christian woman. When Diane married Kenneth at 33 years old, she believed she had found a partner who shared her values and her faith. Kenneth was a manager at a logistics company involved in their church and seemed committed to building a family and a life together. For the first 5 years of their marriage, Diane had no reason to question his faithfulness or his character. They had their 2 sons, bought a modest house, and built what appeared to be a stable, loving family. The first affair happened in their 6th year of marriage, when their younger son was just a year old. Diane discovered text messages on Kenneth's phone from a woman at his workplace, messages that made clear they had been involved for at least 3 months. The discovery devastated Diane, who had never imagined that Kenneth would violate their marriage vows or betray the family they were building together. She confronted him with the evidence, and Kenneth responded with what seemed like genuine remorse. He cried, he apologized, he begged for forgiveness, and he promised it would never happen again. He claimed the affair had been a mistake born of stress at work and exhaustion from new parenthood, that he had never stopped loving Diane, and that he would do whatever it took to rebuild her trust. Diane, raised to believe that forgiveness was her Christian duty, and that her role as a wife was to support her husband through his failings, agreed to work on the marriage. Kenneth attended a few counseling sessions with her, though he became resistant when the counselor suggested long-term therapy to address deeper issues. He claimed the counseling was dwelling too much on the past and preventing them from moving forward. Diane allowed herself to believe that his remorse was genuine and that the affair had been an isolated incident born of temporary circumstances rather than a reflection of his character. For 4 years, their marriage seemed stable. Kenneth appeared to be more attentive, more involved with their sons, more committed to the family. Diane began to believe that the affair truly had been a one-time mistake and that they had survived it and grown stronger. She allowed herself to trust again, to believe that the worst was behind them. Then came the second affair, discovered when their older son was 10 years old. This time it was a woman Kenneth had met at a professional conference, someone from another city with whom he had been carrying on a relationship during his business trips over a 6-month period. Diane discovered evidence of hotel stays, romantic dinners, and intimate exchanges that showed this was not a brief lapse, but a sustained relationship that Kenneth had actively hidden and maintained while coming home to Diane and their children. The second discovery was in many ways more devastating than the first. Diane had given Kenneth a second chance, had worked to rebuild trust, had forgiven him fully and opened her heart again, and he had used that forgiveness as cover to betray her even more deliberately than before. This time the affair was more calculated, more sustained, requiring ongoing deception and planning. Kenneth had looked Diane in the eye every day for 6 months while actively maintaining a relationship with another woman, lying about business trips and working late. Once again, Kenneth responded with apologies and promises. This time he claimed the affair had happened because Diane had been emotionally distant after the first betrayal, that he had felt unloved and unappreciated, that he had sought connection elsewhere because he was not getting what he needed at home. Diane, despite the pain of being blamed for Kenneth's choice to cheat, heard the criticism and wondered if he was right. Had she been too cold after the first affair? Had she failed to properly forgive and move forward? Had she driven him to seek affection elsewhere by not fully restoring intimacy after the first betrayal? Diane's pastor, when she confided in him about the second affair, counseled her to examine her own role in Kenneth's infidelity. He suggested that perhaps she had not truly forgiven the first affair, that her lingering hurt and distance had created a gap in the marriage that Kenneth had tried to fill elsewhere. He reminded her that marriage was a covenant before God, that divorce was a sin except in the most extreme circumstances, and that her role as a Christian wife was to forgive as Christ forgave and to work tirelessly to preserve her marriage. Armed with this counsel and her own deep belief that giving up on her marriage would be a spiritual failure, Diane forgave Kenneth a second time. They went through another period of counseling, though again Kenneth became resistant when the therapist wanted to explore patterns rather than just move forward. Diane threw herself into being a better wife, working to meet Kenneth's needs, trying to restore full intimacy and connection despite her own unhealed wounds from the betrayals. For 5 more years, the marriage continued. Diane convinced herself that this time was different, that Kenneth had truly learned from his mistakes, that 2 affairs had been enough to show him what he stood to lose. She invested everything in believing that pattern could be broken, that character could change, that her forgiveness and love would be enough to transform him into the faithful husband she desperately wanted him to be. Then came the third affair, discovered just 4 months before Diane's appearance on Steve Harvey's show. This time Kenneth had been involved with a woman he met at their gym, someone Diane herself knew casually, someone who had smiled at Diane and made small talk while secretly sleeping with her husband. The affair had lasted at least 4 months before Diane discovered explicit messages on Kenneth's phone that he had carelessly left unlocked. This third discovery shattered something fundamental in Diane. The pain was familiar but somehow worse because it proved beyond doubt that nothing had changed, that Kenneth's remorse after the first 2 affairs had been performance rather than transformation, that her forgiveness had enabled rather than healed. Diane had given this man 18 years of her life, 2 children, countless second chances, and complete forgiveness for repeated betrayals, and he had used every bit of grace she extended to hurt her again. When Diane confronted Kenneth about the third affair, his response followed the same pattern as before. Initial denial, then anger at Diane for checking his phone, then tearful apologies and promises, then explanations that somehow made his infidelity partially her fault. This time he claimed that Diane had gained weight and stopped taking care of herself, that she was always tired and unavailable, that he felt neglected and undesired. Once again, Kenneth was asking Diane to take responsibility for his choice to betray their marriage vows, but this time something was different in Diane. She was tired, so profoundly, deeply tired of the cycle, tired of being hurt and then having to do the work of forgiveness, tired of being blamed for Kenneth's choices, tired of rebuilding trust that he would inevitably destroy again, tired of wondering when the next affair would happen, because she now understood with terrible clarity that there would be a next affair. Kenneth was not a faithful man who had made mistakes. He was a serial cheater who occasionally got caught. Diane's sister Rachel, who had watched this cycle repeat for over a decade, finally spoke the truth that Diane's church community would not. She told Diane that forgiveness did not require staying married to someone who repeatedly betrayed you, that grace did not mean enabling destructive patterns, that protecting herself and modeling healthy boundaries for her sons was more important than preserving a marriage that existed only on paper. Rachel begged Diane to see that Kenneth would never change, that 3 affairs over 12 years was a pattern that revealed character, not a series of unfortunate mistakes. But Diane was caught between 2 versions of her faith and her identity. The teachings of her childhood said that divorce was failure, that her job was to forgive endlessly and love unconditionally, that giving up on her marriage was giving up on God's plan. But another voice, quieter but growing stronger, said that God did not intend for her to spend her life being repeatedly betrayed and blamed for her husband's choices, that there was a difference between forgiveness and foolishness, that she deserved better than a marriage built on lies and broken promises. Diane's older son, now 17, had begun asking questions about his father's absences and the tension in the house. He was old enough to sense that something was fundamentally wrong in his parents' marriage. Diane worried about what message she was sending her sons by staying with a man who betrayed her repeatedly. Was she teaching them that this was normal, that women should accept infidelity, that promises meant nothing, that men could hurt the people who loved them without real consequences? 3 months after discovering the 3rd affair, Diane still had not made a decision about her marriage. Kenneth had moved into the guest room but remained in the house. He alternated between pleading for another chance and growing resentful that Diane had not forgiven him as quickly as she had the previous times. He seemed to believe that forgiveness was automatic, that his apologies entitled him to immediate restoration of the marriage, that Diane's ongoing hurt and hesitation were unreasonable given that she had forgiven him. The 3 months following the discovery of Kenneth's 3rd affair were the most emotionally turbulent of Diane's life. She felt paralyzed by indecision, caught between her religious upbringing that said divorce was wrong and her growing understanding that staying in this marriage was destroying her. She lost weight from stress, barely sleeping more than a few hours each night as she lay awake wrestling with impossible questions about duty, faith, forgiveness, and self-preservation. Diane's church community, when they learned she was considering divorce, responded with predictable counsel. Multiple church members, including her pastor, reminded her of the sanctity of marriage and the biblical mandate to forgive. Several older women in the congregation shared their own stories of husbands who had strayed and how they had chosen to forgive and preserve their marriages, speaking with pride about their decades of endurance as though staying with unfaithful men was a virtue rather than a tragedy. But Diane noticed something these women did not say. They never spoke about trust regained or relationships healed. They spoke only about duty performed, vows kept, families held together. Their marriages had survived, but the women themselves seemed diminished, their voices flat when they spoke about their husbands, their advice centered on endurance rather than joy. Diane looked at these women and wondered if this was her future, spending the next 30 years in a marriage where love had been replaced by obligation and trust by vigilance. Kenneth's behavior during these 3 months made Diane's decision both harder and clearer. He was on his best behavior in many ways, being attentive with their sons, helping around the house, attending church with the family, but he also grew increasingly frustrated with what he called Diane's inability to move forward. He claimed he had apologized, admitted his mistake, and shown remorse, so what more could he do? He seemed genuinely confused about why his pattern of repeated infidelity had damaged Diane's trust more severely than isolated incidents. The 3rd affair had also revealed something about Kenneth that the previous ones had hidden. This time, Diane learned from mutual acquaintances at the gym that Kenneth had been openly affectionate with the other woman in public, that he had introduced her to some of his friends as his girlfriend, that he had been living a double life so complete that people who knew him from the gym had no idea he was married. Kenneth had not just cheated on Diane, he had essentially erased her existence in whole segments of his life. When Diane confronted him with this information, Kenneth minimized it, claiming people were exaggerating or misremembering. But Diane knew better. She had seen the messages referring to plans they had made, trips they had discussed, a future they were apparently building together. Kenneth had not been having a brief affair. He had been maintaining a whole separate relationship while coming home to Diane and their sons every night. Diane's sons were struggling with the obvious tension in their household. Her younger son had become withdrawn and his grades were slipping. Her older son had become angry, asking Diane directly if his father had cheated again and if that was why she was so unhappy. Diane had not wanted to burden her children with adult problems, but she also could not keep lying to them. She confirmed that their father had been unfaithful and that she was trying to decide what to do about their marriage. Her older son's response shocked her. He asked why she was even considering staying, why she would give his father another chance after he had already betrayed her multiple times. He told Diane that he and his brother knew about the previous affairs, even though she had tried to hide them, that they had overheard arguments and seen her crying, that they understood their father was not faithful. He told her that watching her stay with someone who hurt her repeatedly was teaching him terrible lessons about how men should treat women and how women should allow themselves to be treated. His words hit Diane like a physical blow. She had stayed partly for her sons, believing that preserving their family was the most important thing she could do for them. But her son was telling her that staying was actually harming them, that they were learning from her choices about relationships and respect and consequences. She was modeling for them that betrayal should be forgiven without requiring real change, that promises did not need to be kept, that women should accept mistreatment in the name of preserving family structure. Diane began researching serial infidelity and discovered that it was indeed a pattern rather than a series of isolated incidents. She learned that serial cheaters rarely change because the behavior serves psychological needs that apologies and promises do not address. She learned that forgiveness without consequences often enables the behavior to continue because the cheater learns they can betray trust and still maintain their primary relationship. She learned that she was far from alone, that thousands of women were trapped in similar cycles of betrayal, forgiveness, and repeated heartbreak. She also learned about trauma bonding, the psychological phenomenon where victims of repeated harm develop stronger attachments to their abusers through cycles of abuse and reconciliation. Diane began to recognize this pattern in her own marriage. Each time Kenneth betrayed her and then apologized, the emotional intensity of the reconciliation had created a bond that felt like love, but was actually the psychological aftermath of trauma. She had mistaken the relief of reconciliation for the restoration of trust, the absence of active betrayal for the presence of faithfulness. 4 months after discovering the third affair, Diane's sister Rachel suggested they take a trip together to visit their cousin in Atlanta. Rachel had secured tickets to a taping of Steve Harvey's show, thinking that getting away from Memphis and the pressure of church and marriage might help Diane gain perspective. Diane agreed, desperate for any escape from the constant mental and emotional turmoil of her indecision. The morning of the show, Diane dressed carefully, trying to look put together, when she felt completely broken inside. She had lost 15 pounds from stress and her clothes hung loosely on her frame. She applied makeup to hide the exhaustion that had become permanent in her face. She prepared to spend a few hours pretending to be entertained when her entire life felt like it was falling apart around her. As they drove to the studio, Rachel gently suggested that if an opportunity arose during the show to ask for advice, Diane should take it. Diane laughed bitterly at the suggestion, unable to imagine standing in front of strangers and admitting that her husband had cheated on her 3 times and she was considering taking him back. But Rachel persisted, arguing that Diane needed to hear from someone outside their church community, someone who would not pressure her to stay in a marriage that was destroying her, someone who would tell her the truth without religious platitudes about wifely duty and endless forgiveness. Diane did not commit to anything, but the idea planted itself in her mind. She had been seeking counsel from people who all had the same answer, who all told her that divorce was wrong and forgiveness was mandatory. What would someone say who did not share those assumptions? What would someone tell her if they were thinking about her well-being rather than the preservation of her marriage? What would brutal honesty sound like instead of religious obligation? The Steve Harvey show was energetic and warm, exactly the kind of environment Diane needed after months of emotional darkness. She sat next to Rachel, trying to engage with the show, trying to laugh at the right moments, trying to forget about the impossible decision waiting for her back in Memphis. Then Steve announced a segment about forgiveness in relationships, specifically addressing the question of whether some betrayals could be forgiven too many times. Steve's voice took on a more serious tone as he spoke about the difference between grace and enabling, between forgiveness and foolishness, between giving someone a second chance and allowing them to make you a permanent victim of their patterns. He said he knew there were people in the audience who had forgiven partners for infidelity multiple times and were wondering if they should do it again. Diane felt Rachel squeeze her hand as Steve said he wanted to talk to someone dealing with exactly this situation, someone who had forgiven serial infidelity and was being asked to forgive it again. When the production assistant approached their row and asked if Diane would be willing to talk to Steve, Diane looked at Rachel, took a deep breath, and stood up before she could talk herself out of it. Steve Harvey greeted Diane warmly, his presence both commanding and compassionate. He asked her name and invited her to share what was happening in her life. And standing on that stage in front of hundreds of strangers and millions of viewers, Diane told her story. She talked about 18 years of marriage and 3 affairs spanning 12 years. She talked about forgiving Kenneth twice before and being asked to forgive him a 3rd time. She talked about her religious upbringing that said divorce was failure and forgiveness was mandatory. She talked about her sons asking why she would stay with someone who kept hurting her. And she asked the question that had been consuming her for 4 months. Should she forgive Kenneth again? Was she being unforgiving and judgmental by considering divorce? Was she giving up too easily on her marriage? When Diane finished speaking, Steve Harvey stood silent for a long moment, his expression a mixture of compassion and something harder, something that looked almost like anger on Diane's behalf. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but intense. "Diane, I want to make sure I understand what you just told me. Your husband has cheated on you 3 separate times over 12 years. 3 different women, 3 discoveries, 3 rounds of apologies and promises, and you are standing here asking me if you should forgive him again. Is that correct?" Diane nodded, tears already forming in her eyes. Steve's voice grew stronger. "Then let me answer your question with absolute clarity. No, you should not forgive him again. And I am going to tell you why, because I think you need to hear this, and I think millions of people watching need to hear this too." The audience was completely silent as Steve continued. "Forgiveness is a beautiful thing, Diane. Forgiveness is necessary for healing. Forgiveness allows us to move forward from hurt and pain. But forgiveness does not require you to stay in a relationship with someone who keeps hurting you. Forgiveness does not mean erasing consequences, and forgiveness absolutely does not mean giving someone unlimited opportunities to betray you while you take responsibility for their choices." Steve's intensity increased. "Your husband is not asking you for forgiveness, Diane. He is asking you for permission to keep cheating on you. Because that is exactly what you have been giving him. Every time you forgave him without requiring real change, every time you took him back after empty promises, every time you blamed yourself for his choices, you taught him that infidelity has no lasting consequences in your marriage. You taught him that he can hurt you as many times as he wants, and you will always take him back." The audience murmured in agreement, and Steve turned to address them before looking back at Diane. "Ladies and gentlemen, I need everyone to understand something. There is a difference between someone who makes a mistake and someone who has a pattern. A mistake is something that happens once, that the person genuinely regrets, that they work hard to never repeat. A pattern is something that happens over and over because it reveals who that person actually is, not what circumstances made them do. He looked directly at Diane. Your husband is not someone who made 3 mistakes. He is a serial cheater. That is who he is. And I am telling you right now with absolute certainty that if you take him back this time, there will be a 4th affair, and a 5th, and a 6th, because nothing in his pattern suggests he is capable of being faithful to you. Nothing. Steve's voice grew even more passionate. You asked if you are being judgmental by considering divorce. Let me reframe that question for you. Is your husband being judgmental of you by repeatedly destroying your trust? Is he being harsh by blaming you for his choices to cheat? Is he being unforgiving by getting frustrated that you have not instantly restored the marriage after his 3rd affair? Because that is what he is asking from you. He is demanding forgiveness, trust, and restoration while taking 0 responsibility for the pattern of behavior that brought you to this point. He continued without pause. You also asked if you are giving up too easily on your marriage. Diane, you have given this man 18 years. You have forgiven him twice already. You have worked on yourself, gone to counseling, tried to be a better wife, taken responsibility for his choices. You have done everything possible to save this marriage. Your husband is the one who gave up on it. Not once, not twice, but 3 times. You are not giving up. You are finally accepting reality. Steve's tone shifted slightly, becoming more gentle but no less direct. Now let me address the religious component of your question because I know that is what is really keeping you trapped. You were taught that divorce is wrong, that forgiveness is mandatory, that your role as a wife is to stand by your husband no matter what. But, Diane, I need you to hear me. God does not want you to spend your life being repeatedly betrayed and blamed for it. That is not what marriage is supposed to be. That is not what forgiveness means. And teaching your sons that this is acceptable is not honoring God. It is dishonoring yourself and modeling terrible lessons about relationships. The audience applauded, and Steve raised his voice to be heard over them. The people in your church who are telling you to stay, to forgive again, to keep trying, they are wrong. They are prioritizing the appearance of an intact marriage over your actual well-being. They are more concerned with their theology than with your reality, and I am telling you that you need to stop listening to people who care more about the institution of marriage than about the woman trapped in a destructive one. Steve paused before delivering his next point. Here is what 3 affairs over 12 years tells me about your husband. It tells me he does not respect you. It tells me he does not value your marriage. It tells me he believes he is entitled to have both you and other women. It tells me he is skilled at manipulation because he has convinced you 3 times that the affairs were somehow your fault. And most importantly, it tells me that he will absolutely cheat on you again if you take him back. His voice grew quieter, but more intense. You want to know the real question you should be asking yourself. Not whether you should forgive him, but whether you should forgive yourself for staying this long. Not whether you are giving up on him, but whether he gave up on you the first time he cheated. Not whether divorce is failure, but whether spending the next 30 years with a man who repeatedly betrays you would be the real failure. Steve looked directly into Diane's eyes. I am going to tell you exactly what I think you should do, and I want you to really hear me. File for divorce, not separation divorce. Do not give him another chance to promise change he has proven 3 times he cannot deliver. Do not go to more counseling where he performs remorse for a few sessions and then goes back to his patterns. Do not listen to people who tell you that preserving your marriage is more important than preserving your sanity, your health, and your self-respect. He continued with growing force. Tell your sons the truth about why you are divorcing their father. They already know he cheats. They already see that he hurts you. What they need to see now is that you value yourself enough to stop allowing it. Show them that there are consequences for betrayal. Show them that women do not have to accept infidelity. Show them what healthy boundaries look like. That is the most important thing you can do for them. Steve's final advice came with absolute conviction. Stop asking whether you should forgive your husband. Start asking what kind of life you want for the next 30 years. Do you want to spend that time wondering when the next affair will happen? Looking through his phone every time he comes home late? Feeling anxiety every time he goes on a business trip? Blaming yourself for his choices? Performing forgiveness while dying inside? Because that is what staying with him means. Or do you want to spend that time building a life where you are valued, respected, and treated with the faithfulness you deserve? He looked at Diane one last time before concluding. You are 51 years old. If you are lucky, you might have another 30 or 40 years ahead of you. Do not waste them on a man who has shown you 3 times exactly who he is. Believe him, accept it, and move forward without him. You deserve so much better than a serial cheater who blames you for his betrayals. And until you believe that about yourself, you are going to stay trapped in this cycle forever. The standing ovation lasted several minutes. Diane stood on that stage, tears streaming down her face, but something fundamental had shifted inside her. For the first time in 18 years, someone had told her unequivocally that she deserved better, that leaving was not failure, that protecting herself was not selfishness. Steve had given her permission to stop performing endless forgiveness and start prioritizing her own well-being. When Diane returned to her seat, Rachel was crying too. She pulled her sister into a tight hug and whispered, "That is what I have been trying to tell you for 12 years. You deserve better. You always have." On the flight back to Memphis, Diane felt different. Lighter somehow despite the difficult decision she now knew she had to make. Steve's words had clarified something she had been unable to see through the fog of religious obligation and emotional exhaustion. Kenneth was not going to change. 3 affairs were not mistakes but a pattern, and staying with him was not honoring her marriage vows but dishonoring herself. The next day, Diane filed for divorce. She contacted an attorney, explaining the 3 affairs and 18 years of marriage. The attorney was sympathetic but also direct, telling Diane that serial infidelity cases were unfortunately common and that Tennessee law allowed fault-based divorce grounds including adultery. Diane provided documentation of all 3 affairs, preparing for the legal battle ahead. Kenneth's reaction to the divorce filing oscillated between anger and manipulation. He claimed Diane was being vindictive and unforgiving. He said that filing for divorce proved she had never truly forgiven the previous affairs. He told her she was destroying their family over mistakes that he had apologized for repeatedly. He involved their pastor, who called Diane to counsel her against divorce, but Diane, emboldened by Steve's words, stood firm. Diane told her sons about the divorce the same week she filed. She sat them down and explained honestly that their father had been unfaithful multiple times, that she had forgiven him twice before, but that she could not continue in a marriage where trust was repeatedly destroyed. She told them that staying would teach them the wrong lessons about relationships and consequences. She told them that she loved them and would always be their mother, but that her marriage to their father was over. Her older son hugged her tightly and told her he was proud of her for finally choosing herself. Her younger son, while sad about the family breaking apart, also expressed relief that the tension and fighting would finally end. Both boys made clear they understood why she was leaving and did not blame her for the divorce. The response from Diane's church community was mixed and often painful. Some members supported her decision, having watched her suffer through years of Kenneth's infidelity. But others criticized her for giving up on her marriage, for not extending the same forgiveness she had given twice before, for choosing divorce over reconciliation. Diane's pastor scheduled a meeting with her to discuss what he called her hardness of heart and unwillingness to model Christ's forgiveness. Diane attended the meeting but came armed with Steve Harvey's words echoing in her mind. When the pastor suggested she was being selfish and unforgiving, Diane asked him directly whether he thought God wanted her to spend the rest of her life being repeatedly betrayed. When he quoted scripture about forgiveness, she quoted scripture about consequences and about not casting pearls before swine. When he claimed she was setting a bad example for other married couples in the church, she said that staying in a destructive marriage would set a worse example for her sons. The meeting ended with the pastor expressing disappointment in Diane's decision, but Diane walked out feeling stronger rather than guilty. She had made her choice, and it was the right one regardless of who disagreed with it. 2 months after her appearance on Steve Harvey's show, the producers reached out to Diane about doing a follow-up segment. They had received hundreds of emails from viewers who related to her situation and wanted to know what she had decided. Diane agreed, wanting to share that she had chosen divorce and to encourage other women trapped in similar cycles. When Diane walked onto Steve's stage for the second time, the transformation was visible. She had gained back some of the weight she had lost and looked healthier. Her eyes were clearer, her posture more confident. She moved with a certainty that had not been there before. Steve greeted her warmly and asked for an update. Diane told the audience that she had filed for divorce 2 days after her first appearance on the show. She explained that Steve's words had given her the clarity and permission she needed to stop trying to save a marriage that her husband had destroyed 3 times. She shared that her sons supported her decision and that she felt at peace for the first time in years. Steve nodded with obvious satisfaction. "That is what I want to hear. You stopped asking whether you should forgive him and started asking what you deserved, and you realized you deserved better than a serial cheater who blamed you for his choices. How does that feel?" "It feels like freedom," Diane said simply. "I spent 18 years trying to be enough for a man who was never going to be faithful. I spent 12 years forgiving behavior that just kept repeating, and I finally realized that I was enabling him by removing all consequences for his actions. Filing for divorce was the hardest thing I have ever done, but it was also the most important." Over the following year, Diane's transformation continued. The divorce was finalized with Diane receiving primary custody of their sons and a favorable settlement that acknowledged Kenneth's repeated adultery. Kenneth's relationship with their sons remained strained, particularly after they learned the full extent of his pattern of infidelity and his blaming of their mother for his choices. Diane left her church after continued pressure from leadership to reconcile with Kenneth. She found a new faith community that emphasized healthy boundaries alongside grace, that understood forgiveness did not require maintaining relationships with people who repeatedly caused harm, that supported her decision to protect herself and model dignity for her sons. She also started attending a support group for people dealing with serial infidelity. There she met dozens of others trapped in similar cycles, most of them struggling with the same questions she had faced about forgiveness, faith, and whether leaving was giving up too easily. Diane shared her story and Steve Harvey's advice, and many group members said it gave them permission to stop enabling their partner's patterns and start prioritizing their own well-being. 3 years after her first appearance on Steve Harvey's show, Diane was invited back for a final update. By then, she had rebuilt her life completely. She had started dating someone new, a divorced father who understood the pain of betrayal and treated her with consistent respect and honesty. She had developed close friendships with people who supported her decision to divorce rather than judged her for it. She had grown closer to her sons, who respected her more for choosing dignity than they had when she accepted mistreatment. During that final appearance, Steve asked Diane what she would tell other women considering whether to forgive serial cheaters. Diane looked directly into the camera and spoke with conviction. "I would tell them that forgiveness is important, but consequences are equally important. I would tell them that patterns predict future behavior better than promises do. I would tell them that protecting yourself is not selfish or unforgiving. I would tell them that modeling healthy boundaries for your children is more important than preserving a marriage that models dysfunction. And I would tell them that they deserve partners who do not need to be forgiven for the same betrayal over and over again." She continued, her voice growing stronger. "I spent 18 years trying to save my marriage, but the truth is that I was the only one trying to save it. My husband destroyed it 3 separate times. I did not give up on my marriage. I finally accepted that it was already dead and stopped pretending otherwise." Steve nodded approvingly. "That right there is wisdom. You cannot save a marriage alone. You cannot forgive your way into fidelity from someone who is not committed to being faithful. and you cannot love someone into changing when they do not want to change. Diane's story became one of the most referenced segments in Steve Harvey's show history. It resonated with thousands of people trapped in cycles of serial infidelity, struggling with questions about forgiveness and whether leaving was giving up. The segment was shared in support groups, referenced in therapy sessions, and discussed in faith communities, debating the balance between grace and enabling. 5 years after leaving Kenneth, Diane married the man she had been dating, a relationship built on mutual respect and consistent faithfulness. Together they created a blended family with his children and hers, modeling healthy partnership for all the kids involved. Diane often reflected that her sons had learned more about love from watching her leave a destructive marriage than they ever would have learned from watching her stay in one. Kenneth, meanwhile, had been involved in at least 2 more relationships in the years following their divorce, both of which ended when he cheated. The pattern Diane had recognized and Steve had named continued exactly as predicted, validating Diane's decision to leave rather than enabling the behavior for a 4th time. Diane occasionally heard from women in situations similar to what hers had been, asking for advice about whether to forgive serial cheaters. Her answer was always the same: forgiveness for your own healing is valuable, but reconciliation with someone who has demonstrated through repeated actions that they will not change is self-destruction disguised as virtue. If Diane's story resonates with you, if you or someone you know is caught in a cycle of forgiving serial infidelity, take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. Share this story with someone who might need to hear it, because sometimes the most important lesson we can learn is that grace without boundaries enables the very behavior it claims to heal, that forgiveness does not require maintaining relationships with people who repeatedly harm us, and that choosing ourselves is not selfish but necessary. Diane Thompson proved that leaving is not giving up when you are the only one fighting for the relationship, that patterns reveal character more clearly than promises do, and that the bravest thing we can sometimes do is stop accepting less than we deserve. Remember that you cannot forgive someone into changing, you cannot love someone into faithfulness, and you do not owe endless chances to people who use each one to hurt you again.